A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines.
If a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. A different drummer.
And now, coming to you from dead center on your dial, welcome to Risk Parity Radio, where we explore alternatives in asset allocations for the do-it-yourself investor. Broadcasting to you now from the comfort of his easy chair, here is your host, Frank Vasquez.
Thank you, Mary, and welcome to Risk Parity Radio. If you have just stumbled in here, you will find that this podcast is kind of like a dive bar of personal finance and do-it-yourself investing.
Expect the unexpected.
It's a relatively small place. It's just me and Mary in here. And we only have a few mismatched bar stools and some easy chairs. We have no sponsors, we have no guests, and we have no expansion plans.
I don't think I'd like another job.
What we do have is a little free library of updated and unconflicted information for do-it-yourself investors.
Now, who's up for a trip to the library tomorrow?
So please enjoy our mostly cold beer served in cans and our coffee served in old chipped and cracked mugs, along with what our little free library has to offer. But now onward to episode 454. Today on Risk Parity Radio,
It's time for the grand unveiling of money!
which means we'll be doing our weekly portfolio reviews of the 8 sample portfolios you can find at www.riskpartyradio.com on the portfolios page. But before we get to that, we're going to have one big long email.
Surely you can't be serious.
I am serious. And don't call me Shirley.
From friend of the show, Bill Yount, who runs the Catching Up to Phi podcast.
Looks like I picked the wrong week to quit amphetamines.
And is also a donor to the Father McKenna Center, which has moved him to the front of the line. As most of you know, we do not have any sponsors on this program. We do have a charity we support. It's called the Father McKenna Center, and it supports hungry and homeless people in Washington, D.C. Full disclosure, I am on the board of the charity and am the current treasurer. But if you give to the charity, you get to go to the front of the email line on this program.
Excellent!
And that's like a 2.5-month-long line right now. There are 2 ways to give to the charity. Either you can do it directly on the donation page of the Father McKenna Center website, or you can become a patron on Patreon, and you do that at the Risk Parity Radio website, www.riskpartyradio.com, and follow the links there, and you can become a monthly donor that way. Either way, you get to go to the front of the email line, but make sure you mention that in your email so I can duly move you to the front of the line. And now, without further ado,
Here I go once again with the email.
and
First off. Second off. Last off.
first, second, and last off, we have an email from Bill.
Oh, hey everybody, it's me, Mr. Bill, and I'm on the way to the studio to take my new show. Oh no, Mr. Bill presents, hey!
That's Dr. Bill to you.
What am I, a doctor or a moon shuttle conductor?
And Bill writes,
Frank, I have been deep diving on transitioning from an accumulation plan to a retirement distribution plan.
Hey kids, it's time for Mr. Bill's Safety Tips. And here's the star of the show, one of the unluckiest people in the world, Mr. Bill.
Spot, you should know better than to play with matches because they're very dangerous.
Extremely grateful for your expert guidance, friendship, and mentorship on life in general, and using contrarian high-level personal finance and money wisdom to maximize our only renewable resource, time.
Speaking of suffocating,
Freedom to do what we want, when we want, with whom we want, and give back with Red Hot Chili Pepper 5.
Say, I want to watch TV, Mr. Bill.
Okay,
Back to binging your podcast, catching up, and deep diving on plans for transition to pre-retirement 80% of financial independence at market highs, planning a risk parity style portfolio using a blend of Bill Bengen's latest research, your principles of risk parity portfolio construction, and for various reasons, behavior gap, blind spots, lack of interest in DIY with focus on living life without managing money, insurance against cognitive decline, and protecting my wife if I reach end of plan before her. She has no interest in money management and just wants to have the money there, show up, and spend it.
Show me the money! I need to feel you, Jerry! Show me the money! Jerry, you better yell! Show me the money!
I will probably partner with a CFP and CFA with 10 years of experience in billions of dollars of institutional portfolio construction and wealth management, and a holistic flat-fee life planner and financial advisor I found online who happens to use total return risk parity style portfolios in his practice.
That's what I'm talking about.
I don't know if you have gone over Bengen's new book, Research Process to Reach an Investor's Personal Safe Max, but it might be a useful exercise for your listeners to do so using my inputs. Selfishly, I seek feedback on my roughed-out plan. Bengen's elements. 1. Withdrawal scheme. Variable retirement, smile front and back-loaded COLA, CPI minus 1 to 2% for personal inflation, and increasing equity glide path after sequence risk behind us. 2. Planning horizon. Semi-retirement at 63 and full retirement at 65 with a 30 to 35 year estimated longevity. 3. Portfolio tax status. Combination of pre-tax and taxable withdrawals, approximately 2-to-1 split. Will to protect and grow Roths, 10% of portfolio, as able for legacy or use a perpetual withdrawal rate. 4. Legacy. Wish to give money with retirement cash flow budget to kids and charity as able. Roth funding, split house down payment, grandkids college fund, DAF/QCDs, and hope to leave a reasonable portfolio legacy, about 33% of starting portfolio value. Will use decreasing eliminating legacy as a buffer for sequence risk or adjustments to plan if likelihood of success falls below 70%. Will spend more if likelihood of success exceeds 90%. 5. Asset allocation. I wish to use a 60-40 growth-tilted or mildly leveraged less equity-tilted heavy portfolio, possibly consisting of something like this. 25% VUG, 20% AVUV, 10% IDMO, 5% AVDV, 10% GLDM, 15% VGIT or VGLT, 10% DBMF, 5% cash. I'm open to suggestions or feedback here based on your backtesting. 6. Portfolio rebalancing. Guyton Klinger bands quarterly assessed or annually on July 4th. 7. Average passive returns of portfolio accepted. No market timing, performance yield chasing, behavior gap between investment portfolio performance. 8. Withdrawal timing. Monthly on the first of the month to mimic paycheck and reverse dollar cost averaging. I would add to these a 9th element of monitoring our portfolio's performance, drawdown strategy, and real versus planned spending quarterly or annually at year's end. What method do you use? I am thinking of using bands on a critical path of liability matching fundedness-based Monte Carlo analysis of likelihood of success, as mentioned above, with the 90% top line band and 70% bottom line band dictating an increase/bonus or decrease/pay cut, with 80% being the steady state goal. I use Charlie Munger's adage and invert these success percentages and look at them as a likelihood of needing positive or negative course corrections of 10%, 20%, or 30%. Bengen's 4 investor-free lunches. 1. True diversification. He used 55% equities and 11% equal increments in large cap growth, mid cap, SCV, total international, microcaps. 2. Periodic rebalancing. 3. Small cap value tilt, accounted for a large portion, 50 basis points, in moving his safe withdrawal rate of 4.15% based on his research and assumptions in the early 90s. 4. Rising equity glide path, Fau Kitsis paper. My overriding question is, do you have feedbacks, additions, subtractions on this plan globally or its individual components? I am eagerly anticipating how you spice this up with your quips, clips, and maybe a rant or two.
Gee, kids, crossing the street can be very dangerous. Now, first, you have to look both ways. Okay, now second, you have to make sure the light is green. Okay, now it's safe to cross. Make that 4 ways.
By the way, have you ever thought of making all of your videos and audio clips available to your listeners?
Don't be saucy with me, Bernays.
They are classic and could spice up any talks, conversations, lectures that your listeners might give on personal finance.
It's going to be very popular.
That goes without saying. Oof.
Your brother in arms, Mr. Bill. Q, oh no, Mr. Bill. P.S. I have happily donated a few times to the Father McKenna Center.
Okay, kids, we're going to try to cross the street again. Now remember, you have to look all 4 ways. Okay, I think it's safe to cross now. Make that 5 ways.
Well, let's start with the important stuff first, which is your last query about me making a compendium of my video and audio clips available to listeners. You know what that sounds like, Bill? That sounds like another job.
I don't think I'd like another job.
So I'm probably not going to be doing that.
It's not that I'm lazy. It's that I just don't care.
But I'll tell you who has been working on things. Our young Quebecois and top man who's been working on our website.
We have top men working on it right now.
Continues to make improvements and has actually been able to upload all of the transcripts for all of the episodes, going back to episode 1. And they're searchable.
Sacoche.
I don't know how he did it, but I'm glad he did. And he's making more incremental improvements to the website every week.
Chris de tabarnak, tu es mon Chris. Je le sais, tabarnak.
So please check that out at your leisure. But now let's get to the meat of your email. You want to talk about overall planning and how we incorporate the observations from Bill Bengen's new book into that planning. And so I'm going to approach this in a holistic manner, and you'll see how we incorporate the things from Bengen's book into the planning process. But that book is not arranged for planning purposes. It's arranged for analytical purposes. So I would not use it as a checklist, if you will, except in the end to make sure you've covered everything. So before we get to the planning process itself, I want to tell you what underpins my approach, because this is very scientifically based, and it's based on good data science that applies to forecasting, whether it's in the financial context, a medical context, or any other context. It is something that is completely missing from the CFP curriculum. It is partially touched on in the CFA curriculum, but I think it's actually a big problem right now in the world of financial planning because they don't understand good forecasting techniques and the inherent limitations of certain kinds of forecasting.
Man's got to know his limitations.
So the basic forecasting methodology that I use comes from Daniel Kahneman, Philip Tetlock, Annie Duke, and anybody who talks about forecasting, super forecasting, how to do good forecasting using data. And the primary driver or primary principle in good forecasting is to always use base rates as inputs and do not use overly conservative or overly pessimistic forecasting as inputs, particularly into a compounding calculator, because you'll just get garbage out, essentially. You make adjustments for the conservatism or aggressiveness on the output side, not on the input side. This concept is violated repeatedly by what I see going on in the financial advisor world.
Just clap!
Particularly your favorite podcasters who are also financial advisors. And that's because they never studied the underlying concepts of forecasting. Now, the other basic principle you need to understand is the difference between risk and uncertainty. And this is something that Nassim Taleb talked about endlessly in his books. All of his books are about the same thing. When are we operating in a domain that is characterized by risk, that is calculable, and when are we operating in a domain that is more characterized by uncertainty, which is not calculatable, at least with any precision. The best book on this in one place is a book called Risk Savvy. It's written by a doctor named Gerd Gingerenzer, who's with the Max Planck Institute in Germany.
Ausgezeichnet.
And he's got some videos up. This book's been out for a while, but it really defines the problem extremely well. And there's a very important observation in that book and in this area of forecasting that in domains of uncertainty, you're better off relying on simple rules of thumb rather than adding more and more variables and trying to calculate it. This is counterintuitive. You would think that you needed more data in an uncertain environment, but actually having more data doesn't help you. Knowing this does allow you to essentially apply the simplicity principle to a lot of forecasting, because a lot of the forecasting that is done for, say, 30 years hence is not worth the data that's being input, because the shorter the time frame, as in now and the next few years, that is an environment of risk. You can calculate things. Having more information helps you. Once you get out past a decade or more, you are getting to more and more uncertainty, and you are better off using more rules of thumb than trying to add more and more variables and trying to calculate your way to what you'll be doing when you're 90 years old, if you even make it that far. So we'll be using these principles as we go through this methodology and process. Okay, all good forecasting begins with understanding where you are, and in this case, understanding what your expenses are. Because there's zero uncertainty about how much money you're spending in your life right now. Zero. So the more data you have about that, the better decision making you can make. And so the first thing to do is literally go through your expenses from your records for the past few years and figure out what they are. Because chances are your expenses, at least in the near future, probably for the next 5 years, maybe longer, are going to look similar to that anyway. And when you do that, you want to categorize them. You can have as many categories as you want, but you need at least two. One that you would classify as mandatory expenses: shelter, transportation, healthcare, taxes, things you have to pay given your current lifestyle. And food, but not expensive food, just regular food cooked at home. I actually like to divide our expenses into three broad categories. One is mandatory expenses, what I call keep the lights on expenses. And that's the whole mandatory side. On the discretionary side, I divide it into two parts. One I call comfort expenses, which are things like gym memberships and eating out, stuff you do on a regular basis that makes your life more enjoyable. But you could drop it in a pinch if you had to. And then the third category I call extravagances. And these are generally not regular expenses. They're big vacations. They're renovations to the house. They're buying the boat YOLO.
Help me, come on, help, I'm sinking, come on, help, no.
Stuff that you are going to incur on an irregular basis and that can often be planned around. So these are very easy to drop out of the budget. You just decide you're not taking the big trip this year, whatever. Now, when you look at most people's finances, and financial advisors have observed this as well as others, an interesting pattern tends to drop out, particularly for people who are well saved and well prepared for retirement. Typically, about 60% of their expenses fall into the mandatory category, and 40% are discretionary. You know, it's interesting when you listen to people like Ramit Sethi. He comes up with a plan for people's living expenses that revolves around this observation that you really want to get your mandatories at about 60%. When you're accumulating, what you're probably doing is doing that 60% is mandatory. You got 20% that is discretionary, and then you have another 20% that's going to savings. Obviously, when you're in retirement, you don't have to have that savings component anymore. So basically, you have more discretionary possibilities. This also tells you how flexible you are. And that is what Ramit Sethi is counseling people, that you don't have enough flexibility if your mandatories are 80, 90, or 100% of your expenses. Same is true in retirement. And I have found looking at our expenses that we typically fall into this kind of category, which leads to a very nice rule of thumb that goes with a 5% withdrawal rate. And it's what I call the 3-1-1 plan. I've talked about this particularly in episode 338, but also episodes 334, 341, and 324. You should go back and listen to those because I'm only going to touch on it briefly here. So if you are withdrawing at 5% and you're looking at these general guidelines, 3% of 5% is 60%. If that makes any sense.
You are talking about the nonsensical ravings of a lunatic mind.
So 3% of your spend is going to go to mandatory. Then you have 2% for discretionary. 1% of that is comfort expenses, and 1% of that is extravagances. And so that is the general framework that I'm looking at, 3-1-1. And I found that is about as precise as you need to be overall. Your expenses don't need to fall neatly into those categories. They will vary year on year. But if you're tracking them, you will see that, broadly speaking, they tend to fall into these categories based on probably what you're spending right now. Okay, so suppose you've evaluated your current expenses. How do you apply risk and uncertainty to the next stage of planning going forward? Well, everything that's closer in time falls into that risk category. So you can certainly plan out the next few years in as excruciating detail as you want to. And you do want to sit down and think about all of the things that you might be spending money on that are different in any way from what you're spending money on now. And do that for at least a 5-year period, maybe a 10-year period if you don't plan on changing much. But as you get further out in time, the more uncertain this tends to get. And then it's better to start thinking about this in terms of a rule of thumb. The best rule of thumb to think about here first is, when are your personal expenses likely to peak? For most people, they peak sometime early in retirement or even before retirement, depending on their child situation. For a lot of people like us, our expenses peaked when our children were in college. And we've been in retirement 5 years, and our nominal expenses have actually been dropping, which has surprised me, but it's not that unusual. So it's possible that you are already at peak expenses right now in terms of going forward. And that number is important because that is the number that you want to apply inflation to. And what we know from lots and lots of research is that retirees do not experience inflation at the same rate as the general population, because the general population is working, having more children, and incurring more expenses. So this has been researched to death, and retirees experience inflation at 1% to 2% less than the CPI on average. And that includes all of the spendthrifts who are paying no attention to this whatsoever and buying 3 boats named YOLO 1, YOLO 2, and YOLO 3.
Say, Mr. Bill, where are you going?
I'm on my way to a big Hollywood party at Ken and Barbie's. Gee, I sure hope G.I. Joe is there.
Well, how about some Coke first to help get you in the mood?
Well, I'd rather a diet soda. You know, I've been trying to cut down on my sweets.
Well, here comes your agent, Sluggo, and he says all he has is Coke.
No, wait, no!
So that is a good base rate for you to use as inflation going forward on this max expense number. That max expense is a good base rate to start with, and the inflation rate of CPI minus 1 or CPI minus 2 is a good base rate to use for forecasting purposes. I see financial advisors screwing this up badly all the time. And this is how they screw it up. They try to take apart inflation. And they do things like, well, you know, healthcare is going up a whole lot. I better make that 5-6% or some big number.
Are you stupid or something?
That makes no sense, because if you are going to do that, you have to recognize that your total inflation calculation still needs to be that base rate of CPI minus 1 or CPI minus 2. So where is the deflation in your calculation? If you are overinflating one part of expenses, you need to underinflate or deflate another part of expenses. What this means is you have a whole lot more variables, a whole lot more potential for error, and that is bad forecasting. That is bad forecasting.
Am I right or am I right or am I right? Right.
Don't do it. The long-term future is uncertain, therefore you need to use the base rates and not make up a whole bunch of other numbers to complicate things.
Hello? Hello, anybody home? Huh? Think, McFly, think!
To justify your fees, showing you're doing something, advanced and complex. It's stupid.
Fat, drunk, and stupid is no way to go through life, son.
Okay, now if you've got that laid out, you can make this as complicated or uncomplicated as you want. You can use a lot of spreadsheets. You can use popular calculators. It's all the same thing. You're just adding up numbers and putting numbers in a forecast. But I wouldn't fixate or focus on stuff that is over 10 years out in the future. If you are like us, you can actually simplify this even more. Because I know our expenses are going down right now. They will continue to go down for various reasons. One of those reasons is part of our mandatory expenses right now is supporting my parents. My parents are 96 and 91. They're not going to be around in 10 years, most likely.
Death stalks you at every turn!
Grandpa?
Well, it does.
So we're going to be dropping a lot of expenses there. At some point, we're going to downsize this house. We're going to be dropping more expenses there. And you may or may not have a similar situation. But what this should be telling you, for a lot of you, that you don't need to have complicated forecasting if you know that your expenses are effectively going down, even if you're not going to be spending the same money on the same things. But that is where personal finance is personal, because if you were intending to adopt a whole new lifestyle and move to a high cost of living city and buy a bunch of property and do a bunch of other things, yeah, your expenses could go up. That is not the usual pattern of most retirees, however. So you should not be pretending that these expenses are going to appear out of nowhere unless you're actually planning on doing those things. Because again, that's just bad forecasting. Okay, that's the expense side of thing, and that's about as detailed as it can be on a podcast like this, because obviously it's going to be very dependent on your own personal circumstances. Now, let's start talking about how you're going to cover those expenses.
I am a scientist, not a philosopher.
This is something I actually went over at the last economy conference in my presentation there. There are essentially 4 levers of post-financial independence finances that you can pull to cover your expenses. The first one is supplemental income. That includes things like pensions and Social Security. It could also include side jobs or rental real estate or just something else that is generating income.
All we need to do is get your confidence back, so you can make me more money.
Maybe an inheritance if you're really lucky.
Lucky?
The second lever you can pull is asset selection and portfolio construction. You can construct portfolios that allow for more spending, or you can construct them to allow for less spending. And that's a lot of what this podcast is about, and a lot of what Bill Bengen's book was about. How do you construct portfolios that allow you for more spending in retirement? Because if you're not doing that, you're essentially fighting with one hand behind your back. You're not using all the tools that are available.
I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
All right, the third lever is flexible withdrawals, or how flexible are your withdrawals? Now, typically when people are doing 4% rule calculations, they are assuming zero flexibility in withdrawals. They are assuming that 100% of your baseline spending is mandatory. There is no discretionary expenses there at all, and that you are forced to increase your spending at the rate of CPI inflation. It's all mandatory, all the time, all CPI inflation, all the time.
Next morning you find it filled to the brim with jack squat!
In reality, that applies to almost nobody, except people that are very poor, because all of their resources are being used for mandatory expenses. So if you can pull this lever and use flexibility in your spending going forward, you can effectively increase the safe withdrawal rate. The easiest way to do that is to simply use actual spending. That is that base rate assumption of CPI minus 1% or CPI minus 2%. If you are doing CPI minus 1% as your base rate, that effectively adds about 0.5% to your safe withdrawal rate. If your base rate assumption is that inflation affects you at CPI minus 2%, then you can effectively add 1% to your safe withdrawal rate. And if you go to something like a full guardrail strategy, where you are adjusting your withdrawals based on the performance of the portfolio, you might be able to increase your safe withdrawal rate to around 1.3% over its base. What that means is if you are flexible at all, you can probably spend more money than you think you can. Now, this data I've been talking about comes from a number of sources, but the easiest place to find it is in the Morningstar studies they do periodically. It's called the State of Retirement Income. This one comes from 13 November 2023. You can find that at their website and download it. But basically, they took all of these variable kind of withdrawal strategies, applied it to a basic portfolio that could be anywhere from 0% to 100% in stocks, and then saw how the variable withdrawal strategy affected the safe withdrawal rate. And so these are good estimates. And since this is an area of uncertainty as to exactly how portfolios are going to perform in the future, the estimates I gave you are as good as you can get. They're not going to get more precise by running more data through something. And what you should take from this is that if you are flexible, you can spend more money than you think you can, and it's going to be somewhere between 0 and 1.3% more. All right, the fourth lever is the one you don't want to pull. It's the fear and hoarding lever. That if you just cut spending or if you underspend your portfolio, then the rest of this stuff doesn't matter. If you're spending 3% or less, then you can do whatever you want with your asset selection. You can be as flexible or inflexible as you want with your withdrawal strategy. Your supplemental income doesn't matter because you're still just accumulating more money. You're going to die with as much as possible.
What's with you anyway?
I can't help it. I'm a greedy slob. It's my hobby. Save me!
So if you pull that lever down, it obviates the need to even do anything with the other levers, which always amuses me because lots of people in the personal finance space fall into this category. They're grossly underspending their portfolios. And so I'm like, well, why do you bother even talking about the rest of it?
Forget about it.
The only relevance that it's going to have is how much you are going to have when you're dead.
Dead is dead.
If you are grossly underspending, you do not need to focus on asset selection or portfolio construction. You do not need to focus on flexibility withdrawals. You do not need to focus on side income. In fact, you're probably wasting a lot of your time focusing on any of this stuff because you've already solved the problem by not spending money.
That's the fact, Jack! That's the fact, Jack!
You should stop reading about finances, stop listening to podcasts about finances because it serves no purpose in your life. So in my mind, the better way to approach this is to be very light on that lever, focus on using the other levers because then you'll be able to spend more money in retirement and give it away if you're not going to spend it on yourself.
Never been a better time than right now.
And when I look at our own finances, we are essentially giving away 1% every year, about 20% of our expenses. That includes support of my parents, money to kids as an advance on their inheritance, and just charitable giving, which creates a ridiculous amount of flexibility in our plan and allows us to live a much better life in the here and now, and for the people around us to live much better lives in the here and now. Because pulling on that fear and hoarding lever is going to damage your relationships with the people you love. It just is. Trust me.
You no longer love me.
When have I ever said that?
In words, never.
Well, in what then?
In the way you have changed.
But how have I changed towards you?
By changing towards the world.
It's such a terrible thing for a man to struggle to be something better than he is.
Another idol has replaced me in your heart. A golden idol.
It's singular. The world that can be so brutally cruel to the poor professes to condemn the pursuit of wealth in the same breath.
You fear the world too much.
With reason. But I am not changed towards you.
Aren't you?
All right, let's start talking about these levers in more detail. That first one, supplemental income, is the most important one, actually, for most Americans, because most Americans are living substantially on their Social Security in retirement. And if you are one of those people, you need to focus your planning around that as to when you're taking Social Security, whether you have another pension, those other factors. And hopefully that's going to cover most or all of your mandatory expenses. But the general way you plan around that is you subtract your supplemental income, your annual supplemental income, from your annual expenses to get a net amount that needs to be covered by your portfolio. Now, what I just described is actually not the situation that I think most people listening to this podcast are in, at least the ones I've talked to. Most people that listen to this podcast have somewhere between $2 and $15 million for my informal survey. They're not planning on using Social Security or other income as a large proportion of their retirement resources. And so I saw that you did not mention this at all in your email. And so if you are not going to rely much on Social Security, you should still count it at some point. But yes, we can model pretending it doesn't exist and then think of it as a big buffer that's going to come in at some point. Ideally, you would model with and without it. For us, since we retired at age 55 and we didn't plan on taking Social Security until 70, we needed to model without it. If you are retiring at age 65, it's going to be a very important component. It's in the near future, and you should probably be more modeling with it than modeling without it. But for podcast purposes, we're going to pretend that it doesn't exist, or that it has already been subtracted from the gross annual expenses, and so we do have a net amount that needs to be covered by a portfolio. All right, so let's go to that asset allocation lever and talk about that. That's number 5 in your list of 8 things. Now, assuming you want to maximize spending, yes, you do need a diversified portfolio, like a risk parity style portfolio or something like what Bengen suggests in his book. The portfolio you gave us is 25% U.S. large cap growth, 20% U.S. small cap value, 10% international large cap growth, 5% international small cap value, 10% gold, 15% in intermediate or long-term treasury bonds, 10% in managed futures, and 5% in cash. I went ahead and modeled something like this in Portfolio Visualizer using the Portfolio Matrix tool to make it easy to compare it with 20 other portfolios. And I just misspoke. That tool is at Portfolio Charts, not Portfolio Visualizer.
Are you stupid or something?
And you do need to pay $5 a month now to access it, but I think it's worth it. So when I modeled it at Portfolio Matrix and compared it with these 20 other portfolios, it was 4th in terms of safe withdrawal rates at 5.7. The top 3 were the Golden Ratio portfolio at 6.1, the Weird portfolio at 6, and the Golden Butterfly at 6. On the other end of the spectrum of this tool, a total stock market portfolio comes in at 3.8. Classic 60/40 comes in at 4.1. Boglehead 3 fund portfolio comes in at 4.3. I've also modeled Bengen's portfolio out of the book in this same tool, and you do get a similar safe withdrawal rate as the one you have, which is about 5.7 on this tool. Now, what's important about this tool and any tool, really, talking about comparing safe withdrawal rates, is not the actual number itself. It's just knowing that Portfolio A is better than Portfolio B. So regardless of what you think the actual safe withdrawal rate should be, you want portfolios that have higher safe withdrawal rates using the same data sets as other portfolios. And what we've seen time and time again, whether we use this tool or Portfolio Visualizer or the 100-year data set from the Early Retirement Now toolbox, is that these risk parity style portfolios just have higher safe withdrawal rates than standard portfolios. It seems to be at least 1% better.
You are correct, sir, yes!
So for some other comparisons, Bill Bengen's portfolio from his book, he says over a 100-year time frame has a 4.7% safe withdrawal rate. If you run simple risk parity style portfolios through the same data set, you'll get, I think, 4.83 or 5 in the worst case scenarios for those portfolios. And that's only due to the Great Depression. You're well over 5 and even into the 6s for almost every other decade. So what this tells us is that using a baseline withdrawal rate of 5% for this kind of portfolio is very reasonable. It's very doable. In fact, it's conservative. You already have a built-in buffer. Because remember, this calculation is also assuming that your expenses are all mandatory and you will be forced to increase them every year by the CPI rate of inflation, which, as we know, doesn't apply to anybody, or not anybody that is saving for retirement like what we're talking about here. Okay, so we're already underspending the portfolio using 5%. Now, what if we pull on that lever for variable withdrawals? Well, the easy pull is simply just to use our actual predicted spending, which is 1% to 2% less than the CPI. And if we do that, we can effectively add another 0.5 to 1% to this figure, which means you could spend more, or you can just consider that as a big buffer that's built in, which is generally what we do. Now, you can get more complicated with that. You mentioned using a Guyton-Klinger or guardrails approach, which could potentially increase your safe withdrawal rate even further. From my perspective, I would rather just apply the simplicity principle to this, since we're only planning on spending the 5%. If I was trying to spend 6%, yeah, I'd be more focused on a more complicated variable withdrawal strategy. And you can do that, but I honestly don't think it's necessary if you're only planning on spending 5%. And so that covers numbers 1 and 6 on your list. Okay, let's go to number 2 on your list, which is the planning horizon. Your planning horizon is 30 to 35 years, so that's kind of a standard planning horizon that would not change any of these standard safe withdrawal rate calculations, which are geared at 30 years. But one of the most important things from Bengen's book, and that we've known before, but people seem to ignore because they think their portfolio is going to turn into a pumpkin after 30 years.
And it's gone. Poof.
Is that the safe withdrawal rate does not drop linearly as it goes out further in time. And in fact, the difference between the 30-year safe withdrawal rate and a forever safe withdrawal rate is about 0.6. You would subtract 0.6 on a forever time frame. On a 35-year time frame, you're probably talking about subtracting 0.1 or 0.2. Bengen's book has a lot of nice pictures of this. You can also see this if you go to the safe withdrawal rate calculator at Portfolio Charts, because it has these charts showing the safe withdrawal rate going from 15 years to 45 years, and you can see how it flattens out the further you go out. In practical and in simplifying terms, you can use the flexible withdrawal strategy to cover any lengthy planning horizon scenario. Because if you are getting 0.5 to 1% or more just by being flexible in your withdrawals and using the average retiree's inflation, that takes away or covers that 0.6, which would take you from a 30-year time frame to a forever time frame. Which effectively means that that 30-year estimate is good for forever with any reasonable variable withdrawal strategy. And you can use the 30-year time frame as the baseline estimate if you just want to simplify things. And you probably should simplify things here because we are talking about uncertainty when you're talking about 30-year plus time frames. So adding more and more detailed calculations is not going to get you a better answer. This is honestly another litmus test I use to determine whether a financial advisor knows what they're talking about or not with respect to safe withdrawal rates.
It's all one big crapshoot anywho.
Because if they apply some kind of linear function and say, well, if it's 10 more years, you better subtract 1%. Now, this is wrong. This is bad math.
Wrong!
No,
Wrong!
And you're either ignorant or you're just fear-mongering and trying to sell something. You need me to come here and adjust this with my precise tools.
You know, whenever I see an opportunity now, I charge it like a bull. Ned the Bull, that's me now.
And yes, I'll let you spend a little bit more money, but you need to give that to me. It's my AUM fee.
And I have a straw. There it is. That's a straw, you see. Watching. And my straw reaches across the room and starts to drink your milkshake. I drink your milkshake. I drink it up!
The truth is, planning horizon is not that big a deal. Because the big deal in this, and for safe withdrawal rate purposes, is that first decade. Not the first 3 years, the first decade. I think Michael Kitces has actually done the research here. And I know Bill Bengen has said this, that it is that sort of 9 to 11 year time frame from retirement that seems to be the most salient or important in this whole discussion. Because that's what you're really trying to survive. And once you've survived that, your situation is likely to improve if it has not improved already. All right. Number 3 on your list, portfolio tax status. Okay, this is going to be different for every person. And I don't think it makes sense to try to account for this on the portfolio side of things. Taxes are an expense, and you should be accounting for those when you added up those expenses. Taxes are a mandatory expense. And yes, you can estimate them. It's not that hard. The truth is, a retiree's taxes tend to go down because you have a whole lot more flexibility as to when this money comes out of these accounts. You're not paying FICA anymore. This is not a big problem. Now, there's a great book about tax planning in retirement that is just coming out, written by Cody Garrett and Sean Mullaney, where they poke a lot of holes in all of this fear-mongering about taxes in retirement.
Fire and brimstone coming down from the skies, rivers and seas boiling.
40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes, the dead rising from the grave.
Because a lot of that is BS. It's put forth to scare people so that they'll run to financial advisors and buy stupid things or overpay them.
Because only one thing counts in this life. Get them to sign on the line which is dotted.
I would get that book, and you'll learn things like worrying about Irma is stupid and a waste of your time.
Forget about it.
And that RMDs are easy to manage.
Inconceivable.
In any event, I would not try to apply a tax status to the portfolio side of this because it just makes the calculations more complicated. Instead, you need to put a tax estimate with your expenses in the first place based on whatever you think is relevant to that in terms of your portfolios. That is the way you apply the simplicity principle to this. Keep your expenses all in the expense category. Do not mix them with returns. And this is also where you end up with risk and uncertainty considerations, in that your overall tax plan is subject to uncertainty if you're talking about planning over decades. So you shouldn't spend too much time on that, but you should spend a lot of time on what is going on this year or next year and do some kind of assessment annually in the fourth quarter in particular, because that is when you're going to be deciding how much you're going to take out of accounts, which accounts are going to come from. Is there tax loss harvesting? Are there other considerations? Have you started Social Security or not? When are you going to do that? How is that going to affect your tax status? So on and so forth. That needs to be done every year in a granular kind of way. But it's a waste of time to try to do that about your taxes in 10 years' time, other than generally recognizing that you want to spread your tax liability out over as many years as possible, because that's going to keep your effective tax rate the lowest over the course of your life. So if you're not paying hardly any taxes early on, you may be wanting to take more distributions or do more conversions then, because that's going to solve any RMD problem that you might have later. Moving on. Number 4 on your list is legacy. And you say, wish to give money with retirement cash flow budget to kids and charity as able. And I think that's the way to go about this, that make it part of your budget. That instead of thinking about, well, how much am I going to leave when I'm dead and creating a pile of something there, if you just make it a part of your budget when you're alive, then you're already dealing with your legacy while you're alive and seeing it put to good use.
That is the straight stuff, oh Funkmaster.
And more experts in this area are telling people that the best way to manage family wealth is to do it while you are alive and not leave something that needs to be managed or dealt with when you're dead as the primary legacy.
That's not an improvement.
And that's the funny thing about compounding and legacies here, because if you are able to get $62,500 into your children's Roth IRAs when they're in their 20s or even up to early 30s, you let that compound over several decades, it's probably going to double 4 times using the rule of 72, in which case it's going to be worth $1 million. But it's already going to be hopefully in a Roth IRA growing and never taxed for them. And you can also use that to teach them some financial literacy, because that is the biggest problem with leaving a whole lot of money to somebody who ends up being in their 60s, which is the average age that people are receiving large inheritances these days. And these people don't know how to manage their money because you never taught them. You never gave them the money in the first place to help them manage it.
Fat, drunk, and stupid is no way to go through life, son.
And so what happens to them? They end up going to a free steak dinner and buying some stupid annuity products or something.
A guy don't walk on the lot lest he wants to buy. They're sitting out there waiting to give you their money. Are you going to take it?
And you didn't create a legacy, you screwed up your legacy.
Honestly, as stupid as stupid does.
Now, if you do plan, for whatever reason, that you want to leave a certain amount of money to a certain person for a certain reason, probably the better way to do that is simply to just cabin that off from the rest of your assets, put it in some account in something that's going to grow very well. Because if it's just going to sit there for 30 years, you want it in stocks. You don't want it in CDs or something.
Forget about it.
The other way of doing that is through insurance products. Particularly whole life insurance is often used either for somebody who's going to be a dependent for life, a disabled child or something like that. Or if you've got some business that needs to be transferred and there's going to be taxes involved with that, oftentimes a whole life policy helps with that. There is other tax planning that goes for people who have multiple 8 figures, something called private placement life insurance. But that is not really for us mere mortals who are in what Nick Majuli calls level 4, having between $1 and $10 million.
Not going to do it. Wouldn't be prudent at this juncture.
So I don't think you need to complicate it any more than just putting it in your spending budget. You can if you want, but again, if you want to just apply the simplicity principle to this, put that advancement on inheritance or legacy in as an annual budget item to be dealt with at that time, and then you don't need to worry about the rest. And if you do have financial problems, yes, you can cut it, but you're not going to if you've pulled all these levers well. Number 5 on your list was the asset allocation. We already talked about that. Number 6 is portfolio rebalancing, and you mentioned Guyton Klinger bands. Again, here you can make this even simpler if you want, which is just rebalance it once a year. I think the other consideration, though, is whether you want to use a rising equity glide path, like you've also mentioned here, and also is mentioned in Bill Bengen's book. That is something I had studied, but was not very confident about, given the paucity of the research. But now that I've read more about it in Bill Bengen's book, and I'm hopefully going to ask him a question about this at some point, because it seems to me that the rising glide path you would want would still stay within the parameters of having a portfolio with a high safe withdrawal rate, which means going from like 40-some% up to 70% over time makes sense to me. But I don't know what the data actually says about that. Now that we've been in retirement for 5 years, I am considering doing this going forward because it's also going to make rebalancing easier in most circumstances, because in most years your stocks outgrow everything else. And if you have to sell less of them to do a rebalancing, it just makes things easier. So we may be implementing this with one of the sample portfolios next year, because I think it makes a lot of sense at this point, given the state of the research and what we've learned from this book, in addition to the earlier papers and things. What I really wanted to see is, did it affect more diversified portfolios like the one he suggests in the book, as opposed to some kind of simple 60-40 portfolio that might have been portfolio dependent. It seems like this methodology applies generally to most portfolios, and that it's something we ought to be thinking about incorporating because it's a relatively easy operation to deal with. So you can make it more complicated than that with Guyton Klinger bands or anything else. I don't think you necessarily need to do that if you're spending 5% or that's your goal. All right, number 7, you just mentioned that we're accepting average passive returns. Yeah, that's what we're doing. We're not pretending that our assets are going to outperform historical base rates. Again, that is just using base rates as your basis for forecasting and not making up crystal ball assumptions that make them much better, much worse.
Now, the crystal ball has been used since ancient times. It's used for scrying, healing, and meditation.
Because that's just bad forecasting if you're doing that, which unfortunately is what goes on a lot in these retirement calculators. They're bad crystal balls embedded within them.
A really big one here, which is huge.
And you also mentioned as number 8, withdrawal timing, monthly on the first of the month to mimic paycheck and reverse dollar cost averaging. And that's basically what we do. I mean, Mary and I sit down and look at a budget every month. It takes us all of 10 or 15 minutes now because it's mostly the same every month. And we just are adding in extraordinary expenses for the most part, well, lumpy tax payments and other things like that. And then we figure out, well, where is this going to come from? And then I go see if we need to sell something or how that needs to work and put that in the plan for that month and go ahead and implement it. Now, you could also simplify this even more, particularly with your portfolio setup, because you have a built-in 5% in cash in the portfolio. And so another way of looking at this would simply be, let's just spend out of that cash the whole year round and then only look at this once a year, like we're doing with the sample golden ratio portfolio, where we don't have to think about anything. We just spend out of the cash and then rebalance the next year, refill the cash bucket, and there you go. That was the original Harold Avensky bucket strategy. One bucket of cash for 1 year. Very simple. So you might think about that. It's very appealing psychologically because it allows you to not have to look at your assets at all. And if you are passing this on to somebody else to manage, it's an easier way of managing than actually selling something every month. But either way works. That's more personal preference than anything else. Now, you mentioned after that, monitoring the portfolio's performance using funded ratios, repeated Monte Carlo simulations, or other things involving bands. You could do as much of that as you want, but you really don't have to if you don't want to. What I do is just periodically update our net worth and look at the accounts, see where they are. But we really haven't had to change our spending habits based on any of that. So I'm not sure how much value that actually has if you already have a flexible spending plan. So there's nothing wrong with doing some more calculations if that trips your trigger. But you probably don't really need to unless all of your spending is mandatory. But I think this answer's been going on long enough.
This is pretty much the worst video ever made.
No, we're not going to cover everything in an hour. We're on a podcast. But we did cover a lot. I do think you have a good outline of a plan in place. You will find that you will make adjustments as you go, because you will also find that certain monitoring or planning tools may not be that helpful or useful, and that can be dropped after you've been in retirement for a few years. The most important thing you can do right now is to really track your expenses in as much detail as possible for the next 5 years. Because if you get that locked down, the rest of this is going to be relatively easy and can be simplified.
Budget? We don't need no stinking budget. Oh, no.
Because that's where you have the most control. That is risk-related. So more calculating helps, gets you better answers. And that's not true when it comes to this portfolio construction stuff, or getting more and more granular and trying to imagine what things are going to be like in 30 years is not helpful for your planning purposes. It may not be helpful for your psychological purposes either.
Well, you haven't got the knack of being idly rich. You see, you should do like me, just snooze and dream, dream and snooze. The pleasures are unlimited.
Anyway, thank you for your most excellent email and being such a good friend, and for your donations to the Father McKenna Center as well.
Top drawer. Really top drawer.
We'll be seeing you and Karen very soon to engage in some extravagant spending.
Yeah, baby, yeah!
And we'll just leave that right there.
Well, kids, we're gonna try one last time to cross the street. Now remember, look all 5 ways. Okay, I think we can cross now.
Now we're going to do something extremely fun.
And the extremely fun thing we get to now is our weekly portfolio reviews of the 8 sample portfolios you can find at www.riskpartyradar.com. on the portfolios page.
Boring.
Just looking at the markets this year, everything is going up. Means we probably have a weak dollar, which is really the case. You'll find that everything priced in dollars does tend to go up when the dollar becomes a lot weaker. Anyway, the S&P 500, represented by VOO, is now up 12.92% for the year so far. The NASDAQ 100, represented by QQQ, is up 15.15% for the year so far. Small cap value, represented by the fund VIOV, is up 2.65% for the year so far. Continues to be a laggard. But gold continues to be the big winner this year.
I love gold!
Gold, represented by GLDM, is now up 38.8% for the year so far. Long-term treasury bonds, represented by the fund VGLT, are now up 6.37% for the year so far. REITs, represented by the fund REET, are up 9.26% for the year so far. Commodities, represented by the fund PDBC, are up 2.46%. Preferred shares, represented by the fund PFFV, are up 3.49%. And managed futures are managing to make some progress now. Representative fund DBMF is up 4.4% for the year so far. Now moving to these sample portfolios. First one's the All Seasons. It's a reference portfolio. It's only 30% in stocks and a total stock market fund, 55% in intermediate and long-term treasury bonds, and the remaining 15% in gold and commodities. It's up 2.55% for the month of September. It's up 10.69% year-to-date, and up 20.16% since inception in July 2020. Moving to these kind of bread and butter portfolios. First one's Golden Butterfly. This one is 40% in stocks, divided into a total stock market fund and a small cap value fund. 40% in treasury bonds, divided into long and short, and 20% in gold. It's up 2.42% for the month of September. It's up 13.06% year-to-date, and up 51.42% since inception in July 2020. Next one's Golden Ratio. This one's 42% in stocks, divided into a large cap growth fund and a small cap value fund. 26% in long-term treasury bonds, 16% in gold, 10% in managed futures, and the remaining 6% in cash and a money market fund. It's up 2.97% for the month of September. It's up 12.75% year-to-date, and up 46.53% since inception in July 2020. Next one's the Risk Parity Ultimate, kind of our kitchen sink. I'm not going to go through all 12 of these funds, but it's up 3.71% for the month of September. It's up 12.83% year-to-date, and up 34.65% since inception in July 2020. Now moving to the experimental portfolios.
Tony Stark was able to build this in a cave with a box of scraps.
Don't try this at home. These all involve leveraged funds and lots of volatility.
Well, you have a gambling problem.
First one's the Accelerated Permanent Portfolio. This one's 27.5% in a levered bond fund, TMF, 25% in a levered S&P 500 fund, UPRO, 25% in PFFV, a preferred shares fund, and the remaining 22.5% in gold and GLDM. It's up 6.27% for the month of September so far. It's up 16.92% year-to-date, and up 18.12% since inception in July 2020. Next one's the Aggressive 50/50. This is the least diversified and most levered of these portfolios, and most volatile. It's 1/3 in a levered stock fund, UPRO, 1/3 in a levered bond fund, TMF, and the remaining third in preferred shares and an intermediate treasury bond fund as ballast. It's up 5.97% for the month of September. It's up 11.04% year-to-date, but down 2.2% since inception in July 2020. Next one's the Levered Golden Ratio. This one is a year younger than the first six. It is 35% in a composite fund called NTSX. That is the S&P 500 and Treasury bonds levered 1.5 to 1. It's got 15% in AVDV, which is an international small cap value fund, which I think is up something like 37% this year. It's got 20% in gold, GLDM, 10% in KMLM, which is a managed futures fund, 10% in a levered bond fund, TMF, and the remaining 10% divided into a levered fund that follows the Dow and a levered utilities fund. It's up 3.71% for the month of September. It's up 17.93% year to date and up 12.72% since inception in July 2021. And our last but not least is the Optra portfolio. One portfolio to rule them all.
And in the darkness bind them in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie.
This is a return stacked style portfolio. It is 16% in UPRO, it's a levered S&P 500 fund. 24% in AVGV, which is a worldwide value tilted fund. 24% in GOVZ, which is a Treasury Strips fund, and the remaining 36% divided into gold and managed futures. It's up 4.52% for the month of September. It's up 16.51% year to date, and up 19.91% since inception in July 2024. It's only a little over a year old. But that completes our portfolio reviews for this week. And that's probably enough for now because this podcast has gone on for quite a while.
You fell victim to one of the classic blunders.
But now I see our signal is beginning to fade. If you have comments or questions for me, please send them to frank@riskparityradio.com. That email is frank@riskparityradio.com. Or you can go to the website, www.riskparityradio.com, put your message into the contact form, and I'll get it that way. If you haven't had a chance to do it, please go to your favorite podcast provider and like, subscribe, give me some stars, a follow, a review.
That would be great. Okay?
Thank you once again for tuning in. This is Frank Vasquez with Risk Parity Radio, signing off.
Hey, what's going on here? Why are they taking all my furniture, huh?
Well, all that Coke you bought last night was real expensive. You're broke.
No, but I didn't buy it.
Sorry, Mr. Bill, but we'll have to sell the house.
No, wait, no.
Mr. Bill, where are you going?
LA's too dangerous. I'm going back to New York where I'm wanted.
Say, that's quite a long trip.
Yeah, thanks to you and Sluggo, I can't even afford to fly anymore. Wait, what is this place? No, wait, get me out of here, no, hey, stop, wait, I can't hold on, no, stop, get me out of here.
The Risk Parity Radio Show is hosted by Frank Vasquez. The content provided is for entertainment and informational purposes only and does not constitute financial, investment, tax, or legal advice. Please consult with your own advisors before taking any actions based on any information you have heard here, making sure to take into account your own personal circumstances.